the smell of bacon. Bacon makes everything better, right? Welcome to What Is It About the Weather, a podcast where we explore the many ways that weather intertwines itself into our lives. I'm your host, Mark Jelonic, and this week, bacon, or maybe more fundamentally, meat. And we'll get to that, I promise. But as always, I hope you're having a enjoyable weather event or weather setting as you're listening to this, or just one that's not distracting you in a bad way. I had the whole swing, really, this past week. Lightning, first lightning of the year. Early in the week, warm, really got warm. Kind of, 25 C, 75, a little over 75 here. And then, of course, within 2 days, it was snowing. So ran the whole gamut. Not a really bad snow. Had some more this weekend. The one during the week was, it was something. But it's just kind of been back and forth. And there was talk of a much bigger storm up here this weekend. And that didn't really materialize in my area. And I don't think it had the profile anywhere that I was looking that, maybe some of the worst case scenarios pointed out. But, enough to remind us we're still in winter, including some pretty incredible wind. I ended up having to be out running some errands. And I was walking. I fortunately live close to Home Depot, needed to do a little homework, or work at home, I should say, and was headed over there. And it was one of those times when just a lot of wind. And I know some areas reported hurricane strength winds not too far away from me, but that can happen this time of year. That's why we call them nor'easters. Actually, it has nothing to do with why we call them nor'easters, but I was also reminded that back in 1993, the same weekend of the big blizzard. Now, I was in Georgia at the time, and it was a pretty meaningful event. It's funny, I don't know, it's kind of one of those things where you plan on getting snowed in, and had a friend of mine, actually a listener of the podcast, who came over and stayed at my house with my wife and I, and we did some gaming, and it seemed like, it wasn't going to turn anything. It just started as rain, and then finally it changed to snow. But he had to go to work, so he had to drive through some just horrible road conditions ultimately in Atlanta. But nonetheless, up until then, we played some good games and had a nice fire, and ultimately, close to, I want to say at my house, it was like ended up being about 9 inches of snow, which for Georgia that was quite a bit. I don't remember exactly what the final total was. Any case, nothing like that around here this week. And no, this event didn't turn into that. Again, I think a lot of people in other areas, actually to the south, I saw pictures from some people further south of me that, and I mean well south, like, hundreds of miles away, that had some meaningful snowfall. So I hope they were the type of people that enjoyed it. I'm sure there were plenty that didn't, but hopefully some people got it that were looking forward to it. And, as always, it keeps our life interesting, gives us something to talk about, something to communicate about, and something just to enjoy. But as winter's winding down, because, here we are, daylight savings time weekend, it's spring forward, right? I was even doing some spring cleaning past few days. But as winter runs out, I thought I'd get to an episode that's kind of been on my mind. And it's been on my mind for a couple of things, and it really gets down to the fundamental concept. Does winter weather have anything to do with why we eat meat, right, as a species? Often wondered about that, thought about that. And there are a couple of things, like I said, that get me to that. I've been watching this show. Anybody who watches Yellowstone, I don't know, I'm a fan of the show. I enjoy it. Modern day drama set out in Montana here in the U.S., for those who aren't familiar, near Yellowstone Park, right? Really well-known national park. And there's been a prequel called 1883. Now that prequel it's built around the idea of people that moved west in the United States, a migration that happened in different waves, but people going from the East Coast to the West Coast. Because back in the day, there was no easy way to get from one side to the other, if you will. Yes, you could take a ship journey all the way around at that point in time, all the way down to, the tip of South America and come up the other side. There was no wonderful Panama Canal or anything like that at that point. And the other way was still pretty treacherous. Yes, it was coming in the age of railroads coming about and that sort of thing. But fundamentally, this was set as people were leaving Texas, right, along the Gulf of Mexico, and headed west. And that's another option, right? You didn't necessarily have to start your trip in the East Coast. You could do ship for part of the way. And quite frankly, back in that day, it was probably safer in many regards because movement over land was very slow going. And you had to think about moving a lot of stuff. It wasn't just as simple as, hey, I'm going to get my car and go because there's this nice paved road, even once, railroads are there, getting on the train and going. You had to plan. You had to think about food as you're going along the way. And if you're going to settle, what are you taking with you? What are you not taking with you? And that was part of what the show is about. But the show highlighted a idea that was, something that people had to deal with. There was a well-known trail, the Oregon Trail, that went to the West Coast, specifically to Oregon, right? And you always hear these stories. There was even, I remember a computer game that was based on the idea of going west on the Oregon Trail. And yes, you usually died. And the reality is many people did, right? It was a brutal experience for many people. Many died. Some made it. A lot did make it, of course. But, you weren't going to make it on that trip without some folks in your party probably dying along the way. And I was watching that, and I was reminded of a story I saw that kind of caught my attention many, many years ago about the Donner Party, and maybe you've heard of this story as well. It's a well-known group of people back in the so even before this thing was set, mid-1800s that tried to go a different way than the Oregon Trail, maybe a little faster, a little better, and got stuck in some of the snowiest areas in the western United States, or can be. And it's just a brutal story. I mean, of the people that made it to where they made camp for the winter, half of them died. And there's always been stories about cannibalism. And yes, some of the stories may or may not hold. I understand that. But it was a brutal thing. And if I'll put a link in the show notes just to the Wikipedia page. I don't have a really good article, but I've seen documentary stories about it and that sort of thing. It's just one of those kind of fascinating stories because it's a reminder of how we can survive, but how brutal life can be at the same time. And it really got me thinking between that and this other show where, they're trying to stay ahead of winter. I mean, that's kind of one of their goals. Did we really become carnivores, if you will, because of winter weather, right? And that was kind of where I started digging is what role does winter weather have to do with the fact that we do eat meat, okay? And yes, I know there are lots of debates about what the human diet has looked like over time and all those sort of things. But that was kind of the premise I started with. And I started looking right after I was reminded of those two baseline things. And, there's a diet out right now, right? The Paleo Diet. It's an in thing, and it's all the rage. And again, there's a link in the show notes, and I'll talk about it because somebody was interviewed about how much of what we call the Paleo Diet was really how we were. And they really get into the idea of a lot of it really just depended on where people were at the time, okay? And if you lived along a coastal region, you probably ate a lot of seafood. And if you lived in areas that had a lot of grains and berries and stuff, you probably ate a lot of that kind of stuff. And if you lived in areas where there was a lot of game, you probably ate a lot of that too. But in wintertime, if you're in some of those areas, some of those things might just go away if you're not along the coast or if you're not along a place where, the grains or any of that sort of thing. If you're not on an island that has banana trees, but you're way inland in cold climates, you probably did hunt and eat that way. I mean, that's just kind of the prevailing idea of the article is there again, it's kind of in the context that you shouldn't think of the paleo diet as there was this magical one diet that everybody ate. It gets more back into the idea that the paleo diet, it fundamentally is more about eating unprocessed foods, I think. No matter what you consume, whether you adhere to more of a vegan style diet, which there probably were people that ate more closer to a vegan style diet, or if you eat a very protein rich diet. And yes, there were groups that certainly did have a higher protein profile. And that includes actually even Neanderthals. So they've looked into this, right? And that probably has a big part of their diet profile, if you will, had to do with the idea that they were in these regions that were much more prone to harsher winter conditions, or a lot of their range was. And so during wintertime, back in a day when it used to be the same thing in the U.S., bison used to roam this country. There are a lot of things like the caribou that still do, but nothing compared to what the animal profile was like back in the day when human-type creatures were in much lower quantities. And so it is easier to be a predator when there's lots of prey around. But woolly mammoths and other things were not the fastest beasts in the world. And no, you don't just go and kind of bring down a woolly mammoth, but a little enterprise, a little, basic tools, and yes, you could. And that could feed a lot of people for a long time. And when there's no food to be gathered, and think about it, back in that day, this was before we even had come up with the basic idea of preserving food, whether it was a jerky type thing or, had developed clay pots so that you could ferment things that would stay and keep in different weather profiles, right? So the reality is, without certain things to eat in the wintertime, they probably ate a lot of meat. And it seems like their bodies were more capable of having a very high protein diet, because we humans, we don't. That's why they actually tell you to kind of limit your protein intake, is because we're not necessarily equipped to do very high levels of protein. Whereas back in the day, Neanderthals were geared towards that. But even early humans that, depending on the region they were in, may have been more accustomed to it. And this was, gets back into the idea of what the paleo diet looks like is different. Let's be real. When you look at the planet, right, there are people that look different, that have different physical features, both inward and outward, and they probably developed very much based on the conditions they were in, and that includes the diet, right? So in an area where you have plenty of fruits and vegetables, you developed that way, and your systems are used to it. Have you ever done that, right? I had a friend, right, in college that came from a culture that didn't eat a lot of meat, came from India, and that's just not a thing they do, right? And they weren't opposed to eating meat, but it was difficult for their system, and so they had to do it in either small quantities or they had to build it up over time because their bodies just weren't used to digesting that type of food, okay? And this gets into that idea that it's likely that people in climates that were closer to, Arctic regions or that got a lot of snow in the wintertime did indeed, particularly if they were inland, right, did indeed consume more meat just because that was what was easily available. And it's no different than areas along, even cold areas along the coast. If you lived along the coast, you ate a lot of seafood. Right? You didn't necessarily all of a sudden have a different sort. It was a different type of protein. And again, a lot of animal fat in both of those scenarios. But if you lived along an area, like I said, that had your only choice was banana trees, you probably ate a lot of bananas. So weather probably does contribute to not just whether we were carnivores, but very much what the profile is. And weather and climate, and I mean that, in that sense, is whatever your standing weather is. But if you're dealing with a harsh winter, you're going to eat what's available. That's what people do to survive, and people did to survive, right? So we did gather, we did fish, we did hunt. And interestingly enough, I found a thing that even suggested that maybe we hibernated. There's proof, we've found a couple of amazing cave systems in Europe where they've found histories of, just very, very old gatherings of humans. Now, let's be clear. Not every group of humans was lucky enough to have a big, wonderful cave to hang out in. And many of them survived other ways. But it showed that in that scenario that maybe they just slept a lot in the wintertime. Yeah, well, it maybe not hibernation of how you think about just magically sleeping for months on end, but they found that their bones had the same sort of calluses that they find with hibernating animals, which is, you develop differently because you kind of shut down for about, let's say 3 months out of the year or whatever it is, right? While it's really cold. And you do a lot less. And if you've ever watched a show on TV like Alone or some of these others where that's kind of what you do, you preserve energy and you do a lot of sleeping or a lot of not moving because you don't want to burn calories that you don't have. And doing everything when it's cold out takes more energy, right? So did we, did winter weather magically make us these creatures that ate meat? No, but winter weather probably did contribute to different people in different regions deciding what the best diet was for them. Okay. And at the same time, there is evidence that suggests that maybe one of the reasons that humans outbeat Neanderthals was one of the challenges with living in some of those colder climates or inland climates is that they didn't develop the same way. And humans that, came along developed in ways that they were faster and more agile, and they could win out in comparison to that group. Maybe not in the same setting. Maybe, if they were all in the same setting, there would be advantages to each. But humans were better equipped for a wider range of possible outcomes, right? I don't know. I find this kind of stuff interesting. And when you think about, again, you get back to this, it's the paleo diet. And I know in another year or two, we won't hear paleo anymore. It grew on top of the Mediterranean diet or whatever it is. Fundamentally, I actually agree with the idea that we should all eat less processed foods. Not always realistic in the world in which we live to get fresh foods easily every day because it takes time, right? It takes time to do those things. And as I was doing spring cleaning this week, I was reminded that, if we were animals, we wouldn't have to go through any of this stuff and clean out and get rid of this or that or the other because you just wouldn't have those things, right? You'd worry about more of the basic things in life. But that's neither here nor there. If we were that, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, right? So anyways, all right, I'll leave you with that. I did notice when I was preparing this week that this is episode 199, so we're about at 200. And yes, episode 100, I did take a bit of a hiatus. Not planning to do that. I mean, if many of you who know, there was a good reason that I kind of had to put things on pause at that point in time. Not doing that in the short term. But let me know if you've got idea. Again, maybe it's your diet's impacting weather. I don't know. If you got some show ideas, have any thoughts as we move into another century of episodes. I mean, it's hard for me sometimes to kind of wrap my head around the fact that I've been sitting here babbling in front of a microphone for, 4 years, more or less, doing these episodes, and that people continue to listen and enjoy them. And that's all a wonderful thing. But as always, I'm always looking for your thoughts and ideas about things you'd like to hear about, topics that may interest you. And again, it can be a wild thing that you have, just have never thought about, or you want someone else to put some thought into, or just something that's always been on your mind. Either way, let me know. whatisabouttheweather@gmail.com, right? That's certainly one way to get me. You can find me on Twitter, Mark_Jelinek, or the podcast, What Is About the Weather, is also on Twitter. As I've said before, you can support the podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/weather, whatever it is. Communication's always welcome. Love hearing from you guys. And I hope you're having some enjoyable and pleasant weather that's to your liking. But the next time, just remember, the next time that you dig into a bag of jerky, just remember, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.